Good morning, homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me in my kitchen. Today we are making Morning Glory muffins. And Morning Glory muffins are typically made with zucchini, carrot, and raisin. And they're a type of bran muffin usually. And this recipe is an adaptation of a recipe from Susan over at Farmgirl Fare, which is an old blog that I started reading probably in 2010, so a long time ago. It is since defunct, but somebody's still paying the fees to keep all the information up. She has a section of that blog called Farmhouse Kitchen, I think, or I can't remember. I'll put it on the screen. This is an adaptation in that, one, I really don't like raisins in almost anything, and so I'm using dried cherries from our own cherry trees in this instead of raisins. You can use whatever kind of dried fruit you like. Cranberries would also be good. And then I am doing a gluten-free version of this rather than a wheat version of this, just because I find it's a little easier on my old body and my joints. And so the gluten-free flour that I'm using in this is a mix of the regular gluten-free flour recipe from Cooks Illustrated, and you can find a link to that recipe in the description of my gluten-free bread recipe. And then half of it is also from Cooks Illustrated. It is a whole grain gluten-free recipe. It's mostly teff flour, which is a grain that comes out of Ethiopia. And I really like it. I tend to cook with whole grains. I've done a lot of baking with whole grains over the last 20 years. And when you look at a regular gluten-free flour, it's refined white rice and lots of starches. So potato starch, tapioca starch. It's basically a giant starch bomb. And so it works great in baked goods, but it's also just has like no redeeming value in terms of nutrition and in terms of fiber. And so I was thrilled when Cooks Illustrated came out with a gluten-free flour blend that was actually whole grains. And so this has teff, it has brown rice flour, and it has flaxseed in it. So I'll put the recipe for this down below in the description so that you can make that if you want. In order to have some nice nutrition in there, but I didn't want them to be super heavy, I went half regular gluten-free flour and half whole grain gluten-free flour. And then I also have a cup of oat bran in this recipe. The original recipe calls for wheat bran because that was typically what you would put in a bran muffin, but I prefer oat bran to wheat bran. And then I decreased the total amount of actual flour. I think the original recipe with all the different grains combined was 4 cups. I'm doing 3 cups here. This is a big recipe. It actually makes more than a dozen muffins. You could probably get 18 out of it if you stretched it. And so you'll see that I have a couple of extra baking cups in there for the extra batter that I had. We are going to use homegrown zucchini, and the zucchini that I use in this recipe is one of the big giant ones that got away from me. You know, if you don't harvest for a day or if you miss one, you always end up with a really, really big zucchini. And the classic use for that is in some kind of baked good. I also am going to be doing a recipe for zucchini bread, so look forward to that as well. And then some carrots, grated carrots. And these carrots are actually they're still in my refrigerator from probably last October. I bought 20 pounds of carrot seconds from a local farmer friend of mine. You'll see that they're a little bit funky shaped. They have been in my fridge under refrigeration since October. It is now July, and you can see what kind of shape those carrots are in. So there's lots of ways to preserve carrots. You can pickle them, you can pressure can them, you can freeze them. But honestly, if you have refrigeration, just refrigerate them. Carrots last a really, really long time in the refrigerator. It's really all you need to do, unless you have a root cellar, in which case use a root cellar. I am starting to get carrots from my own patch this year. So these are a couple of carrots that I just picked today. Here's an example of what a carrot second would look like. We call these character carrots, but I am still working through a little bit of those carrots from last year, and so that's what went into this recipe. It's a delicious recipe. It's got molasses and honey in it as sweeteners, and nice and hearty, but really wonderful flavor, and gluten-free. And honestly, I would eat these even if I didn't have any issues with gluten. They're just delicious. So let's get started. So I'm just going to give this bad boy a quick wash and then trim off the ends. And this has been sitting in my kitchen for at least a week. And so the stem end is a little bit spongy, and so I'm trimming a little bit of extra off there. And you don't have to do this, but on Zucchini that are this big, I like to scoop out the center cavity with the seeds. Particularly this variety, the seeds tend to get pretty good sized, and it's just spongy and doesn't really have much redeeming value, so I just scrape it out. And it goes to the chickens, they enjoy it. And this was way more than I needed for this recipe, and so I stashed the extra grated zucchini in the fridge, and it goes into a zucchini bread recipe later. There's our 9-month-old carrot, and you can see it's not one straight piece, which is why they call it a second. And then I'm just going to use my food processor to grate these down. You could certainly do this by hand. There's something very gratifying about using a food processor to grate vegetables. And look how gorgeous that carrot is. It's still solid, it's crisp. So here's our oat bran. This is 1 cup of oat bran, 1 cup of gluten-free white flour, 1 cup of whole grain gluten-free flour, 2 teaspoons of baking soda, a teaspoon of baking powder, probably a half a teaspoon of salt, check the recipe below, a couple teaspoons of cinnamon. Give that a good stir, make sure everything's mixed well. And then for our wet ingredients, we've got 2 farm fresh eggs, 2/3 of a cup of yogurt, 2/3 of a cup of milk, and you could certainly use non-dairy here if you wanted to. 1/3 of a cup of vegetable oil of your choice. 1/3 of a cup of molasses, and I love when recipes do this, when the measurements are the same for oil and sticky stuff, so that you can measure out the oil first, and then the sticky ingredients tend to just run right out of that container because it's coated in oil. 1/3 of a cup of honey. Little splash, about a teaspoon of homemade vanilla. Make sure all of that is well mixed. And then we're going to combine our wet and dry ingredients, classic muffin technique. And then add in our veggies. That is probably about a half a cup of dried cherries, a cup of grated carrots, a cup of grated zucchini. Mix everything well. And then any kind of gluten-free recipe, the batter tends to be pretty gritty if you don't let it hydrate. And so you'll get a much, much better product if you let it sit for about 5 minutes before you start dishing it out. I love these dishers for doing messy batters like this. I use it for pancakes, I use it for muffins, I use it for cookies. I like to put a little sprinkle of raw sugar on top just for some crunch. And that goes into an oven, 375, I believe, for about 25 minutes. You can see the extra overflow in those extra little ramekins there. And that's all there is to it. I love this muffin tin, by the way. I'll put a link to it below. It's really easy cleanup. Give this recipe a try, tribe. It's really great. These were delicious and a great way to use up some veggies and sneak them into baked goods. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, like, subscribe, and share. I have new content coming out every week.